Now, tariffs on over $100 billion of Chinese goods heading for American shores came into effect on Sunday as the China-U.S. trade war continues to escalate. The 122-page document detailing items hit by the tariffs include a wide range of consumer goods such as clothes, nappies, dishwashers, and footwear. This comes ahead of further hikes planned for October and December, which U.S. President Donald Trump delayed to alleviate the pressure on the Christmas season. Now, China has retaliated by levying tariffs on a small number of imports from the U.S., including soybeans and crude oil. But just how badly will this hurt American consumers? How are Chinese businesses reacting to the instability? And is there any end in sight? Well, joining me to discuss the latest developments are Brandon Blackburn-Dwyer, founder, Grasshopper Strategies, and Qinduo Senior Fellow of Pangoal Institution. Great to have you both with us. Now, let me start with Brandon first. A document released by the U.S. government runs for a staggering 122 pages, as we mentioned. They detailed a huge range of everyday products which are set to be hit by the new tariffs. To you, how significant are these new tariffs given this dramatic shift to consumer products? And could you highlight some of the types of items which now will be subject to the levy?
Well, on a big picture, this is incredibly important because this tranche of tariffs is really and truly centered on consumer goods. Previously, most of the tariffs have been on intermediary goods, supply chain goods, input goods, things like steel, things like aluminum, which we've also hit Europe with. But these tariffs go after flat screen TVs, cell phones, smart speakers, toys, things that people actually buy in stores in finished price products, and so they're going to see the price go up. Now, what's interesting, though, is Donald Trump was very bold and said, we're going to tax everything. So he really finished any more imports from China were supposed to be covered on September 1st. He then blinked and basically admitted, you know what, we're not going to tax toys, we're not going to tax smartphones, we're going to delay those to December 15th because if we started taxing them now, then Christmas shopping could be negatively impacted. So what we have is on September 1st, today, we have flat screen TVs, smart speakers, and a few other very consumer-based goods, but we are really missing out on laptops, smartphones, and toys, which probably would have hit consumers much more directly in the pocketbook.
So I want to talk about the impact of this dramatic shift to consumer goods. What is it going to do to Chinese export companies and also American consumers who are primarily bearing the brunt here? Mr. Xu, let me bring you into this. Now, according to Bloomberg Intelligence, exports of food and clothes from China are predicted to drop by 3% for the implementation of these new tariffs. What does this mean for Chinese businesses, first of all? How badly will they be damaged?
Well, I think, of course, the Chinese economy, the manufacturers will be affected. It's really about to what degree they will be affected, just like the U.S. consumers will be affected. And also, if you look at the Chinese PMI, the figure of the production, for example, in particular, the private sector figure from Caixin PMI, actually, its number for the August, just past month, is 50.4 points. Is the so-called expansion territory compared to the previous month of June and July. It's expansion. It's for the first time above 50 points here. So it's pretty strong. Of course, people say, whether that included the front loading, people were anticipating the tariffs, so they would probably purchase more before the heat of the tariffs. So that could be a factor. But I think it's really about there are a lot of factors. For example, we had the devaluation of our RMB, so to some extent that will be there will be some relief for the U.S. consumers as well as probably for the Chinese producers here.
Right, and some analysts are already saying that the low-income Americans are going to be the ones who are going to be hit the hardest. Brandon, your thoughts on this?
Well, I disagree a little bit when people focus on solely low-income Americans. That is the belief that China only makes and produces cheap goods, right? Things that you get at Walmart. But the reality is Americans across the economic spectrum shop at Walmart. Americans across the economic spectrum buy cell phones, flat-screen TVs, laptop, toys. These are all items that are going to hit every American across the economic spectrum. and it's going to cost them a lot. We have estimates out there that the previous rounds of tariffs cost Americans somewhere between $400 and $600 a year in additional costs, and this new round of tariffs is going to push that over $1,000 of additional expenses for the average American household. This is a problem when in America we have estimates that about 60% of consumers in America could not handle a $400 unexpected bill. That's how close Americans live in terms of savings versus credit cards versus bills versus other things. So if we're talking about raising their cost $1,000 over the course of the next 6 months, that's a lot. That's going to shake consumer confidence. We had the largest drop in U.S. consumer confidence in the last month that we've had since 2012, when we were still in the midst of the major parts of the recovery of the financial recession. So we have a real problem coming in the United States. It's going to hit American consumers, it's going to hit American manufacturers, and it's going to hit Chinese companies. But at the end of the day, by the time we get to January, we could have some real concerns if there is not relief found in talks.
And we already have data released on Saturday showing that China's Purchasing Managers Index dropped to 49.5, the fourth consecutive month that this key indicator of economic growth has contracted. Analysts have suggested that markets may well have already adjusted for the latest round of tariffs. But Mr. Xu, should we expect to see a further fall in China's PMI?
That's a good point. This figure for 49.74 points, that's what we call it. Mostly it covers like 1,000 Chinese, large Chinese companies, so-called, including SOEs, state-owned enterprises. So it's a bit different from what I mentioned about the PMI, Caixin PMI. That's mostly about the private sector companies. So if you look at this larger company indicators, like it's smaller than 50, and that means contraction territory. But I think this is in line with the general trend. If you look at the Chinese manufacturing sector, Japanese manufacturing sector, South Korean manufacturers, even that of the United States. United States is 49.9. It's also the first time, I think, in some time below 50. So you do see the effects of the China-U.S. trade war over there, the effects on China, effects on the U.S., on other economies. But if you also, today, Beijing time, Monday, if you look at the performance of the Chinese stock market, is actually there's a strong growth, partly because of the confidence. For one thing, we are waiting for, there's a planned ongoing talks between the two sides, and also you see the PMI in the private sector is not that bad. It's actually growing. So people do have the confidence. I think they welcome somewhat optimistic sign.
So there are the sentiment of confidence there in the resiliency of Chinese economy. Let me get your take on this, Brandon. We have forecasts, other forecasts, also predicting that economic outlook over the medium to long term could be even more gloomy. They have suggested that many businesses have stockpiled in anticipation of the tariff hikes. Should no progress be made on the trade war, worse may be still to come. But how resilient do you think is the Chinese economy?
Well, we have a couple of different things happening. One, we've talked a lot about the PMI and the purchasing managers. The real concern here is not that it's just been contracting, but that it's contracted from second quarter into third quarter. If you look at the global holiday shopping season, third quarter manufacturing is when all of the products that are made that are actually sold in the fourth quarter. And so for China to see contraction in the third quarter in the manufacturing, that's a real concern long term, that we're just not going to see as much purchasing going on in the fourth quarter. And that's going to affect China and the globe. On the flip side, you have China really announcing today a lot more infrastructure projects, a lot more focus on returning to using coal to sort of fuel domestic building and consumption, which is what China is going to want to do long term. China's been working for the last 15 years to move itself away from being completely reliant on exports to being much more of a domestically driven economy, akin to, say, the U.S. or Europe, which makes sense since it's the second largest economy in the world. Right. Its consumers can fuel China's long-term confidence, long-term support, and we're seeing that, but it's a transition, so it's always going to be questionable how quickly it can happen.
Right, and besides boosting domestic demand, Mr. Xu, is China now actively exploring alternative markets beside the U.S.?
Well, I think just as Brandon mentioned, on one hand, of course, you would have the effects, negative effects from the trade war. both China and the U.S. suffers from this conflicts. At the same time, of course, you would have the choices by the government about the tools they are going to use to spur or to offset the impacts from the trade war. And I think for China, there's still ample, I would say, choices in the toolbox to really support the economy, at least for protracted trade conflicts with the U.S., if not for strong growth in the... despite that, I would say yes, there are difficult times ahead, but I believe, as Brandon mentioned, if you look at the Chinese middle class, it's about 300 million, 400 million. So that's a growing, large middle class, and I think that will support the Chinese company to weather over this crisis.
Right. I want to talk about China's retaliatory measures now. Beijing has levied a 5% tariff on crude oil as one of its retaliatory measures, and this is the first time that energy has been targeted in trade war. So 2.8% of China's crude oil imports, worth more than $6.8 billion US dollars, come from the U.S., putting it 10th on the list. But now, Mr. Xu, again, is China seeking alternative sources of crude oil imports to avoid Chinese companies and consumers being hit?
I think if you look at, of course, the oil market, because of the trade war, actually the price is going down. So I think that's not a big problem for China in terms of the supply. But as part of the, let's say, as part of the policies against the U.S., see the trade war attacks from the Trump administration, this is one of the, it's a good choices probably to hate the U.S. crude production, because this is one of the area probably you can make the administration to feel the pain of having this trade war, and hopefully there will be some change.
Right, and the ideological drive behind a trade war is to deter companies and consumers from purchasing overseas products and instead purchase domestic products. Brandon, the U.S. doesn't have the manufacturing capabilities to produce all these items internally. I mean, no country, in fact, in a globalized consumer market can survive this way. So isn't the truth that this is not about trade, but about the U.S. trying to punish a rising China?
Punishing a rising China is, I think, taking it too far. What this is about is it's more than just trade. It's about U.S. interest in intellectual property, forced technology transfers, level playing field. That's where this started. I'm not going to say that the Trump administration has kept it anywhere near that rational level, because at this point, it often feels more like Trump just proving that he can do something to look powerful, to look politically strong. But in reality, for some of the economics, that's where this is about. It was about intellectual property. And there's a reason that prior to the Trump administration, we did not see tariffs being used on this level, on this stage, on this scale in decades. Why? Because the global economy has changed. This isn't the 1920s. We can't shut our borders and make everything at home. American companies are the ones being hurt by the inability to manufacture in places like China or Vietnam or India. American companies are being hurt by the inability to sell in Europe, in China, across Southeast Asia. It's no longer our companies versus theirs. It's no longer if we don't make it inside America, then American companies aren't involved. It's the exact opposite. And it's that disconnect from economic reality that has been where the real damage has come from the Trump administration. And they, again, have really kind of forgotten any sort of economic rationality and turned this into a complete political football that just allows President Trump to continue to deny reality, continue to make this about pushing against China and getting to goals that he can't even define anymore. And we're all paying the price.
Well, can I
Sure.
I slightly disagree with Brandon here. I do think there's politics. I do think there's geopolitics at play here in the thinking of the Trump administration. It's not only about the trade. If you look at the, for example, so-called forced technology transfer, in the recent survey of the U.S. companies in China, only 3% of them say, yes, they have some experience of so-called forced technology transfer. Only 3% of thousands of U.S. companies in China. So this is you would question, how big a topic is that? And also you remember, Trump himself has said that, under my watch, I will not allow China to replace the U.S. to become the #1. So it's really about U.S. global preeminence. U.S. just can't tolerate and the challenger continue to rise, so they have to do something. I do suspect there is the intention to sabotage through the trade war the rise of China, the continuous rise of China.
All right, I appreciate your different opinions. We're going to have to agree to disagree here. We're running out of time. We're going to have to leave it there. Thank you very much, Brandon, and also Mr. Qinduo joining me in the Beijing studio. You're now watching The Point. Join us after the break when we'll be discussing the latest protests in Hong Kong. Stay with us.